Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Welcome to another episode of the Prose Cons podcast. I'm your host today, James Healy, and joining me we have Paddy Boylan.
Hello.
And Phoenix Reg.
Hello.
How are both of you doing today?
Who are you asking?
What are both of you reading at the moment? What are you consuming? What are you watching? Paddy?
Well, James, I just finished Hilary Mantel's excellent book, Wolf Hall.
Wow, all
650 odd pages of it.
You got through that very fast, yeah.
I couldn't stop. I haven't, it's been a while since I've read a book where I'm looking forward every day to carving out time to just be able to pick up and read this thing. I love her writing so much. It's so good. And considering the topic we have to talk about today, I've actually got a lot to say on the matter.
Right.
I also finished an audiobook of Fatherland, which you suggested, James.
Yeah.
So Fatherland is quasi-historical fiction. It's set in the Third Reich if they had won the war in Europe, and the Third Reich is now consolidating their power over Europe. And I don't know if this is a spoiler, but importantly, because the Allies and the Soviets never came into German territory, what happened in the concentration camps was never found out. And the story follows a detective, a police officer in the Reich, and his particular case starts to lead him on the trail that will eventually uncover some pretty awful shit. Yeah, it's fascinating. Second Robert Harris book I've read so far, and he's great. He's very good. Yeah. No, that's me.
Yeah, I love how he does great history, but he kind of sets up enough of a narrative, enough of a character.
Yes.
To walk through the history that he's trying to discuss and stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
The guy's his historical details are wonderful. It's it makes me want to read more historical fiction, frankly.
Definitely. His Imperium series on Rome is
mentioned that.
It's some of the best stuff I've read. Like it's really good.
It's in the queue.
Yeah, jump on it. It's really good.
Mm-hmm.
And Phoenix, how about yourself? What are you reading or watching?
Today I finally finished Lord of the Rings.
Nice.
Right. All three books.
All three books.
Okay.
I thought I had a bit to go, and the ending kind of snuck up on me because there was like this much at the end, like quite like a few hundred pages left, and it turns out that was all appendix for all three books. And so I was like, oh, it's over. But I quickly needed to steal myself from the room and walk into the other room so I could be alone because my heart was crying very much. And I was like, oh my gosh. But it was very beautiful and rewarding. And then apart from that, my partner and I have watched like 2.5 or 3-ish seasons of Hunter x Hunter. And I think we're going to stop because we've reached a part where the narrative's getting a little off the rails, and they're kind of throwing plot points just out the window, and it's becoming unsatisfying. And my partner's looking at me right now like, what do you mean we're gonna stop? But
well, that sounds like the time to abandon ship, frankly.
Think, yeah. No, it became very dissatisfying. So, but interesting stuff in there. I do have some stuff to talk about with that one.
I've also started reading Town Hall. Not Town Hall, Wolf Hall.
Wolf Hall. They're both halls.
Town Hall Steps. That's
yeah, little plug.
Yeah.
Alex Eldridge's Town Hall Steps. I started reading that as well. It's really, really good. And I've just watched the series The Haunting of Bly Manor, which is a story of an au pair who comes in to take care of some kids in a mansion, which is like really haunted and stuff. So that was really good. That was on Netflix. I very much enjoyed that.
Is that related to The Haunting of Hill House?
No, it's a very similar name.
Okay.
And they probably picked it up. Netflix probably picked it up because it's a lot of similar themes.
Mm-hmm.
So if you enjoyed one, you'd probably enjoy the other, although I feel like Bly Manor has less of a horror feel to it. It's probably a little bit more character driven. I preferred it. I didn't particularly like the we had an argument about this over the week.
Yeah, somewhat.
Yeah, we won't get into it again.
What do you think of what do you think of Wolf Hall, James? Just sorry before we launch in.
Yeah, absolutely loving it. I'm only about 2 chapters in, but God, it's gold. Like it's every little scene is so good. The character moments are really strong. I'm not into it enough to know who's going to be a main character or not. So part of me is reading it like, if that character doesn't come back into the story, they were so well developed for just a little bit of story that they were in, but then they may be main characters. So she might be setting them up for later on. But yeah, it's really, really strong writing. Yeah, I'd recommend it to anyone. Yeah, it's really good. Okay, so
Wolf Hall, was that?
Wolf Hall, yeah,
Wolf Hall,
by Hilary Mantel. It's historical fiction. Yeah,
I think we're either all reading it or everyone either has read it or
there was a moment where in this where everyone came and showed their Wolf Hall copies, like around. So it's popular.
It's going to be the new Moby Dick of the podcast.
Yeah.
All right, so our topic for today is making characters real, or something, my favorite word, verisimilitude in characters.
Verisimilitude, yeah, that's come up a few times on the podcast, I think.
Sounds nice in my mouth.
It does.
I like it. Yeah. So what I particularly wanted to ask you guys was not to think just yet of like really good examples, but if you guys can think of stuff that you've been reading or watching recently, and whether or not the characters come across as real, or whether or not they feel not necessarily off, but do they feel authentic? Do they feel like real people, or do they feel like something else?
So just because I have recently finished Lord of the Rings, I was thinking through Lord of the Rings because the characters have felt very real to me. And I had to get real with myself about this one, because I was like, do they only feel real to me because they're so well established in pop culture? Like they're just like so cemented in our pop culture psyche right now that I just kind of take them as real characters. There's movies about them. I have images in my mind. So I kind of had to separate that out because they do feel real. And when I read Gandalf on the page, like he felt like a real presence. And I had to think about like why they felt so real. And one thing I've been thinking about recently with characters is like, you know, what does a character want? And like, does that character want something? Do they have desires and things like that? And when I applied that to Lord of the Rings, it didn't really like fit so much. I'm like, well, they kind of all want to destroy the ring. Like that's kind of their, I mean, they're like little micro desires and stuff, but the goals felt pretty unanimous. And the thing I kind of landed on that made them feel so real to me is their emotions are very believable. And even Gandalf, who's kind of like a pillar of wisdom and he's kind of like a rock for everyone, even he has like anger flares. Like he'll flare up, he'll get really angry, or he'll get like really disappointed, or he'll like be overtaken with joy or something. He's very susceptible to his emotions.
That comes across in the movies. Ian McKellen's performance, like there's points where he gets outright cantankerous. I really liked that.
Yeah.
Fool of a took. Yeah.
Or just like, and so you feel it. It's like you don't know how he's going to react, and you kind of have that little like you're scared of him a little bit, or at least I was. It's like he's so wise and powerful, and so like represents the truth so much, and that almost makes his anger all the more painful, because it's like he's angry for real reasons, but it's like very, I don't know, you never know what you're going to get. As well as like Frodo he's a whole web of emotions and feelings and all these things. And but yeah, I feel like Tolkien does characters' interior worlds very well, and everyone feels very emotionally complex, and that's what kind of delivered the verisimilitude.
I've not read Lord of the Rings. I've seen the movie like everybody else in, I was going to say the English-speaking world, but the world. But I've heard not exactly a criticism, but one comment that people have made about Tolkien's writing is that there is no sexual dimension to his world. In his world, sex and romance, or even interest in sort of the opposite sex, sort of doesn't exist. And maybe that's the kind of thing that you don't notice when you're reading it. You know, like, wait a minute, characters never... But do you, as someone who's read it, is that something that you ever like, that feels missing, or that feels...
Because there was definitely romance plot lines between some of the characters. I'm talking
in
about
the films. There were.
There is romance.
Okay.
No, there is romance between there is romance between a few characters, but it is very like high romance, like very like come walk with me through the gardens, as opposed to like noticing, I don't know, I've never seen someone more forlorn and cold, and in that you are beautiful. Like it's very poetic romance and stuff. It's kind of fun. I never thought about that until you said it just then, but it is kind of missing. And that's kind of where it's like in terms of sexual desires, as well as in terms of like individual motives, it actually feels very one-dimensional. Like the motive and the goal is very pure. It's evil versus good, and destroy the ring is like the ultimate pole of the world. So it is kind of one-dimensional in that this plot line is like, it's easy and digestible in that way. So it is, his character depth really comes from emotion for me. And like there's a lot of deep appreciation of beauty, and there's a lot of deep appreciation of nostalgia and home and friendship, and like there's a lot of like heart bleeding moments and stuff. That's where they come alive off the page for me.
It's interesting. Kind of just jumping off Paddy's question, because you said the characters were very complex emotionally. I was wondering, were they complex in their flaws, kind of in Paddy's suggestion of like there not being much kind of sexual desire? Did the characters have any like dark motives or any like complexity to their motives as well? Because I know you said they were emotionally complex, but were they, I guess, psychologically complex as well? Or was there a back and forth between their purity?
That's interesting. So one thing that kind of came to my mind about this was around the imprisonment of Saruman, because I don't know if it's like psychologically complex, but they're kind of like, I guess I would say they're unpredictable, and they're not, I guess who I'm thinking of right now is Treebeard, and like he's very like, Treebeard and Saruman's relationship is really interesting in the sense that Saruman has committed this great crime and like marched against these other civilizations and is doing terrible, terrible things. And then Treebeard is eventually like stationed to keep eye over him. And he's like, that's his task, while everyone goes off and continues with everything. Like, keep an eye on Saruman, don't let him out of the tower. Because unlike in the movies, Saruman doesn't die like off the tower. He actually lives through to the very end. And that's kind of a very like complex situation, because it would have been easy to just kill him off, and it's like that's the end of his plot, he's dead, he's gone. But instead they keep him, and you actually see him as someone whose power has been stripped, and like who's reduced to this just nasty, like he has no power, his voice is shriveled, but he's still there, and he's still bitter, and he literally becomes a curse unto himself. And I feel like and then Treebeard eventually decides, like against his orders, to actually let him go and let him like wander the world. And it was kind of like this weird moment of like, whoa, you decided that. And it kind of felt like I felt betrayed a little bit. Like it was like in a video game, it was like, all right, we've captured that turret, or like that waypoint, like that's solid, that's done. And then you come back and it's like, oh, we've like a leak's been let out or something. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit here. I don't really know where I'm going with this, but at the end of the day, it was like, it felt like Treebeard acted of his own volition outside of the plot almost. And I'm like, what are you doing? But he justified it as like, I don't cage any living thing beyond need. And he's like kind of destroyed himself. And then Gandalf actually disagreed. He was like, I feel like he's still capable of some nastiness, like some mischief in a small, nasty way. Like, yeah, he's not as grand as he once was, but he's still capable of some damage. And it was this weird, I don't know. And that felt very human. It was like a disagreement, but what's done is done. Like, he's gone, he's out in the world. Like, we can't really do anything about it. Here we are. There wasn't much sense to it. He could have kept him in the tower, but he didn't. I don't know.
There's a sense
This
to
is
that.
this is all rambly.
That's okay. Well,
I like it. Yeah, it's good.
one of the points I've got written down, because I actually made notes before this episode. I was thinking about
Somebody
how,
did.
yeah. Oh, I was thinking about how a lot of character complexity, and I think we can all agree that like complexity of character is one of the things that makes characters real. A lot of character complexity is revealed or is even created as characters, as the plot changes, as things happen to the characters, but as the characters are put under pressure and as their situation changes. I mean, Saruman, at least in the films, is unflappable, absolutely in command of himself character. You talk about his imprisonment in the tower, and he just sort of comes apart at the seams. I mean, that to me is something that I'm not going to say the character in the films wasn't realistic, but he was certainly didn't have a whole lot of depth. He was a bad guy.
Yeah.
He was imperialistic. I imagine that would add more depth and more realism. This is another aspect of his character. It's the pathetic. It's the desperate.
Yeah. And he was like, he did like he proper like it was like he was still Saruman, that like heart like a black heart. He just had no power, so he was still like spiteful, and
It's
like
pathetic,
when he
right?
spoke, it was venomous, but it was petty, and it was like small, and it was like, and he really saw it like the way Tolkien does like magic and curses is very subtle, and it really was like at one point Frodo's talking about like, oh, his curse is one beyond us. But like from a reader, you're like, what curse has been put on him? Like, what's going on? But at the same time, he is very cursed. Like he's incapable of hearing words of forgiveness. He's incapable of hearing mercy. Like, and I don't mean that in the sense that he's literally been made like magically deaf to it. But anytime Frodo showed him mercy, he was incapable of actually being grateful or like accepting it. He only like came back with more venom and stuff. And that's where
That's quite
I
deep.
don't know. Yeah, it was deep. And it was
I think
a very real character moment.
Yeah. I think what I was saying about I guess kind of how the characters, you were saying like the characters are very pure in their intentions and stuff. And I was looking for a little bit of like psychological complexity. I think it almost works better in that it's wrapped into the theme that, like you were saying about how he became venomous and he became almost trapped within himself. That almost, it's like he's crossed over a line. You know what I mean? I guess Tolkien might have had characters on either side of that line, and then whereas I was looking for characters who go back and forth between that. I was looking if the characters go back and forth between that within themselves. He's almost divided it in terms of so that works within the story, that works within the team of what he was doing and stuff. I quite like that. That makes sense. Am I making sense right now?
The one that actually felt the most psychologically complex to me was Sauron, which in the movies he doesn't have much of a presence, like because he's just the eye. He's
just
the
a scary eye.
Yeah, the scary eye. In the books, he actually feels way more human because they talk about how he's scared and he doesn't know what's going on, and he's actually very in the dark a lot of the time. All he knows is the ring has come back, but he doesn't really know where it is. He has an idea, and he's kind of he's putting out his feelers and trying to find it. And their whole strategy for destroying it is our one saving grace is Sauron could not fathom someone wanting to destroy it. So like he's thinking, oh no, my weapon has fallen into my enemy's hands, and some of them are powerful enough to wield it. So surely their move is to use it against me. And they could actually kill me if they did. Like some of them are powerful enough to do that. So he's actually very in the dark and very scared, and a lot of the protagonist strategy is to pull his attention by trying to tug at his expectations. They want to pull his attention to Minas Tirith, away from where Frodo is. They want to, at one point Aragorn holds the like ball from Orthanc, that like direct the like crystal ball from the movie, the black crystal ball. He holds it to reveal himself to Sauron, because if Sauron sees Isildur's heir, he's going to start freaking out. He's like, oh shit, like this is my worst nightmare come true. Like that's the sword that cut off my finger before and whatever. So they actually they play mind games with Sauron a lot, and he actually suffers from those mind games. They really pull at him, and he that sways a lot of the tides of the war, actually. is Sauron's mental stability, really.
That's really good. It really makes sense now how they sent like the ring with the hobbits, because they were like the weakest of the group, and Sauron wouldn't have thought of that. He'd have been like all about might and power and strength. They'll give it to someone strong and have them come straight at me. Like, that's really, really interesting.
It's also interesting that in the films, he isn't a complex character. He's barely a character at all, just sort of a force of nature. But when I think of the films, I don't really think of that as a problem. You know, I was thinking before about like,
yeah,
I mean, it's easy to take for granted, I guess, as a writer, that a character needs to be realistic. I don't know that they always do. I mean, certainly unbelievable isn't good, but like, let's take the Star Wars franchise, right? The first 3 films, the characters are realistic, I guess, but you wouldn't describe Star Wars as something with super realistic characters. The characters are just, because it's almost like a soap opera, you know, a space opera. The character is as real as they need to be. And some of those larger than life and very much a stereotype of myself character traits, I think in some genres can sort of work, actually, in the genre's favor. Like Saruman as not so much a complex character, but just as an implacable force. I mean, it's fantasy and is the big bad. So I think like just almost the 2-dimensional force of oppressive evil isn't really a bad thing.
Yes, something I was going to say was that I was going to ask you about what you're reading, because not every story needs to be populated by authentic characters. Sometimes you're going to have characters that are very stylized or very maybe overblown and exaggerated, and depending on the story, that can work as well.
Yeah,
kind of depends on what you're going for. Paddy, can you think of any examples of stuff you're reading at the moment, or stuff that you've read recently? I'm feeling all this stuff.
You know, it's interesting because it is historical fiction. So you think like, well, of course the characters are realistic. It really happens. But, you know, you can read like an interview at the end with Hilary Mantel, and one of the things she says about her writing this is, I mean, first of all, happened in the 1500s, right? So a lot of the nuance, a lot of the characters is gone. And she talks about how as an author, that gives her this space in which to play. Like, yeah, at the same time, it's like, oh crap, there's no character detail to draw on. But at the same time, it's like, now I can fill in the gaps with what I want. This guy, Thomas Cromwell, who she's writing about, famously, he didn't keep a diary. There was the only things we really know about his personal life are what other people have said about him. And even then, he really kept to himself. And it's given her this incredible license to write this really amazingly complex, paradoxical inner world of this guy. For example, the guy, you can see historical paintings of what this dude looked like, and at least one character in the book says like, yeah, you look scary. And sometimes he's like taken back by that, like, what do you mean? It's like, no, you look like a murderer. And he's asking people later on, like, do you think I look like a murderer? Like, it really bothers him. Because on the one hand, he's got this scary reputation and this almost like a boxer's face. It's really flat and hard and stuff. But at the same time, like, he loves small dogs. He's really kind to children. He's very respectful to women. Those kind of paradoxes, I think, make a really interesting, rich character.
I'm very early in it, and I already have a sense of intimidating off him.
Yeah.
Based on what other people have said and based off how people approach him. I think
but he's kind of, you know, because his father is this like violent man as well. At the same time, like, he knows he can use the intimidation and the sort of more thuggish aspect of his countenance and the way he can present himself. At the same time, he doesn't want to be that. He wants to only wear it as a mask.
Okay.
James, I don't remember the question that you asked me.
Realisticness to characters, that a character is realistic. Verisimilitude. I'm just going to keep saying verisimilitude whenever the conversation rolls.
Wonderfully. Let me give you one more example from Wolf Hall. There's another historical character called Thomas More. Thomas More is actually sainted by the Catholic Church later on, so I think it's quite controversial that she writes anything less than a perfect character. But even though he's been sainted in Catholicism, of course, he was a real person. So, I mean, if you're listening out there and you do believe saints were real people, okay. I think a historian might have a different take. And her take is this man he's very, very smart. He's piercingly intelligent, but he's got that arrogance that certain intelligent people do, where he also almost sees himself as infallible and above corruption, and he sees corruption everywhere else. Another thing is this guy is often, he's often he makes like criticism and witticisms at other people's expense. He will put people down, but you learn that's not so much cruelty on his part. It's because he wants them to respond and retort and come back and almost criticize him. This is an intelligent person who revels in the give and take of conversation, in the mental sparring of it. So you learn that, this guy's not just criticizing people because he's a jerk. He's criticizing people because like that's how you get them to defend themselves. That's how you get them, you stimulate them. That's how you get them to speak their truth and come back at you. One of the saddest parts in the novel, like I won't spoil anything, but the guy gets imprisoned and he's just so desperate for conversation. It's not having conversation that cripples this person emotionally. And it's very sad. And if she hadn't established that that's one of his driving motives early on, he would just be a much more two-dimensional character. Yeah, it's those things I think she does. It's those kind of a character's doing something and you think you have a handle on why they're doing it, but there's actually more complexity. There's more depth to why they're doing the things they do that maybe they don't even understand. That's me rambling, Phoenix.
It was a good ramble though.
Thank you, but I could talk about Wolf like a week straight. I think I'm really into this.
Yeah.
It's an example of a text where like it's all about realistic characters. It's all about depth of character. On the other side of, I guess, the extreme from like the soap opera.
Okay.
I actually thought I have a question off of this about characterization in general, not Wolf Hall specifically, but like, because I'm kind of thinking like, you could think about a character and be like, and they have this hobby and this hobby and this job and this job and this quirk and this quirk, and you could just pile a bunch of traits on them.
Yeah.
And yeah, you might get someone, chances are it's an exercise that'll lead you to someone pretty real feeling. Maybe you don't put all those details in the book, but kind of organically someone might be born. But I guess I'm trying to think of like, is a real character, I guess, could you have a real character that you would define as real in a book, but you also didn't care about? Or is the care like,
is you the author or is you the reader?
Do you the reader, or
okay.
like do you really make a character, or I guess as both, like, do you think you could make a character that felt real that the reader didn't care about? Or do you think the I guess the aspects or qualities of the character are more important than the care? Or like, I guess you could have a one-dimensional character that like somehow, as long as the reader cared about them, maybe they would feel real. Like, and so I guess maybe it's a combination somewhere. I'm just trying to think of like, because there is an art to it, because it feels clumsy to just pile a bunch of character traits onto someone and just kind of keep throwing things in a bucket. But it's like, there's some line between character traits and actually creating a story around them that generates care and motive and wanting to spend time with them.
Yeah, I think that what I would think the distinction is that the character traits, like you're saying, is almost a tool for the writer to say, well, this is their job. As you're writing a character, you've given them all these traits, maybe just blankly on a page. These are like the points for you to remember as you're writing the character. But then it's how the character feels about all of those things, which is what makes them real. It's almost the character's reactions. So on the one hand, you might have a page of like, this is their relationship with their father, this is their job, this is their goal. And these are all just bland points. But it's as you write the story and you have them react to all of these things that starts to make them feel real.
Yeah. It's how they live those points, right? It's how they actually drag those points through the world and bounce off other people, and how it informs their inner life. Yeah.
And then bouncing off other people, almost often obstacles that they come across in their way, and how do they react to their obstacles and how do they overcome their obstacles. That's what makes a character real. I don't know if that would by itself necessarily make someone care about a character. I think that caring aspect, I think that we are naturally empathetic and that we do empathize with the familiar when we see it in characters. But I think there also needs to be a sense of drive and a sense of where are they going in things. Something I always come back to again and again with empathy was the TV series The Sopranos, which I watched when it was coming out on TV like 10, 15 years ago. And then I watched it again recently. I just streamed it and I watched one episode after the other. Completely different experience. I think it was actually meant to be watched with a bit of time passing in between, because the main character a lot of the characters actually seem utterly reprehensible.
Can I interject quickly? I'm sorry to derail you, but that's actually the reason I stopped watching The Sopranos. Everyone said it was wonderful. I think I watched episode 1 or 2 and I'm like, I don't like this guy. He's just a jerk. Like, I don't see any way how I can have an in with this character emotionally. He seems like an asshole. But I understand that, like, maybe not the whole point, but a lot of Sopranos is seeing this guy's vulnerability and his weakness and actually his depth and how he's not just this two-dimensional thug, right?
Yeah, because did you watch one episode after the other?
I think so. It was years ago. Man. Like you said, it was a while, but I'd never stuck with it.
I think it's interesting. Something interesting about human behavior, I think, because I think it was meant, you're meant to watch it with a bit of space in between. And bear in mind that there was like a year between each season. Yeah. Because he was a really beloved character. Like, when the show ended and stuff, people were like, oh my God, I can't believe I can't spend time with Tony Soprano anymore. But when you watch it through, you're like, oh, he's a horrible person.
He is.
Because I think that we naturally forgive people. And when you have a bit of space in between these unpleasant acts, it's almost his vulnerability and his emotion and who he is that we connect back to, and we almost forgive the acts.
I was going to say forgive. Yeah. It's like, but he did this when he was talking to his counselor or psychologist without,
That was something I particularly noticed watching it through, because he gets worse as the show goes on. It's almost like that anti-hero thing of, you want him to be a good person, but as the show goes on, it's worse and worse and worse and worse, essentially. But you build up a connection with this character, so you keep forgiving him and you keep hoping that he's actually a nice guy. He's going to be all right. Yeah. And what they did was they almost had like a very human moment prior to a very unpleasant moment. And then the episode would end, so you had a week to forgive. And they would bring it back in and have a very human moment, and then a very, very unpleasant moment. And I thought it was a really interesting setup. One of the best scenes I felt was a scene where the camera is like outside of the room looking into the room, so almost like you're an observer from another room. He's getting ready for a party. I think it's a birthday or something that's happening in his house. And he steps up on the weighing scales and looks down. And you're watching this from, the camera is like back watching him, so you're not seeing his perspective. You're just seeing him get up on the weighing scales, look down, step off, takes his belt off and throws it to the side, and gets back on the weighing scales, steps off and kicks his shoes off, and then gets back on the weighing scales and then gets off looking real happy with himself. And I was like, that's a beautiful
very real, right? Very believable.
We've all done that. We've all given ourselves credit to having achieved, basically. They had that in between two probably murders or something, some really horrible stuff, which brings you back into he's okay, he's all right.
If Tony Soprano wasn't as real and you're not able to infer as much reality into his character, do you think he'd be as able to be forgiven?
No, not at all. I think it is. I think it is in those little moments that brought people back to the show again and again. And I think it was in particular with the anti-hero character, it is that we almost want them to be good, but they keep being bad, and we almost like that. I'm thinking Bryan Cranston's Heisenberg in Breaking Bad.
That's been in my mind this whole conversation.
He was a great anti-hero because he was such a good. He had all the setup of a good person at the beginning, and he got worse and worse and worse and worse. And it was something that we really enjoyed.
But the redeemable and the good was always there at the back of that as well. It never went away. It was always just shrinking.
That was what wanted in the end, I guess, was that good act. But it always goes a different way, or you need it to go a different way if you're doing an anti-hero type character.
Right. So when we talk about like anti-heroes, there's a real anti-hero, I think it sounds like, and when I think about it, I think it is like they need to be quite realistic, because you need with real people in the world, if you know someone, except like, yeah, he does bad things, but he's a good person. Whereas like, let's say we hear about a historical figure, all we hear about are the actions that we're remembered for. There's no depth. You can't consider them as a real full human.
Well, let's take a Deadpool, for example. Deadpool doesn't seem like a real person, but he's a great anti-hero because he has at his core this like emotional drive. Do you know what I mean? He's so
I never really bought that in the Deadpool movies. I didn't love the movies and I didn't love the character, and partly because it felt like, hey, I'm wacky and I'm murderous, and then they staple on like, but sometimes I care. It felt very formulaic. They're adding the caring and the emotions so that you don't just think he's
You felt like you saw the nuts and bolts of it?
I really do.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
didn't feel he was real.
Yeah, fair enough. I thought it was really funny that he was so obsessed with how he looked. I was like, that's a really like for a character who has like immortality, and he's like, but I look like shit. I was like, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
Trying to win back his girlfriend, but he looks terrible. So I thought that was so funny.
It's almost like it is the anti-hero makeup, and I liked that movie a lot, the first one. But it's almost like you take the anti-hero formula or something, and it's almost like I guess for the case, it's a superhero movie. It's meant to be like kind of crazy and stylistic. So it's almost like it's like two-dimensional depth in like a one-dimensional movie, and it's like, I guess what you would want in that kind of movie, because it's like you have the sorry,
it's like it's more than you're expecting.
It's just like, I guess it's like caricaturistic anti-hero traits. So it's like everything's kind of like Paddy said, you can almost see the nuts and bolts of it, because it's like crazy wacky behavior, but he sometimes cares. But it was enough for me. It was like, yeah, I believe it, and in the context of the movie, I'm like here for it. So it's like, I don't know, it fit the style of the movie, I guess.
Yeah, I think
that's it, really.
Tony Soprano and Deadpool are like the opposite ends of the spectrum for me in terms of how to do an anti-hero. Tony Soprano was like the slow boil, whereas Deadpool was like all the traits of an anti-hero thrown together in like an hour and a half with like tons of CGI action.
I wanted to so there's this game that I absolutely love called Dwarf Fortress, and basically it's like almost a big simulation. Yeah, it's very literal as to what it is. The game's incredible, and it's a big, basically gigantic random story engine where you can try and have some control of the world, but weird things are just going to happen, and inevitably your fortress catches on fire. But the point is, one of the things is all your dwarves, who are the inhabitants of your fortress, have randomly generated personalities, and it's quite like a depth. Quite an in-depth like psychology system for them, like bafflingly in-depth. And sometimes you get these really paradoxical traits emerge in your dwarves. Hang on, let me check my notes. So for example, let's say you could have a dwarf that has a really high loyalty score. Not loyalty, duty. They have a strong sense of duty and they do their duty, right? Okay. But then sometimes they can be paired by being really lazy. And at first you're like, okay, well, how am I going to imagine this dwarf? Like, yeah, it kind of makes sense in the gameplay, but a lot of the joy is like imagining these characters as real. How do you have a character that's very dutiful and very lazy? In that paradox, though, I think can come a lot of realism. This could be a character that's, let's say, I'm
instantly thinking someone who like gets the job done, but in a way
cuts as many corners as possible.
Do nothing. Yeah.
I didn't even think about that, but that is one way of doing it. Or maybe they value duty really heavily. They chide others for their lack of duty, but when it comes to themselves, they don't actually get the job done.
I'm thinking of a character that puts themselves in like an administrative role, and then is very by the book, but by the book in an interpretation that allows them to not really do much.
But it makes you think, like, to what you were saying, Phoenix, you can have like these list of character traits, but like the actual living character is sort of almost what happens between them. As a technique, I want to try and write more characters that have these kind of contradictions that at first seem like, well, this doesn't make sense. But when you try and force the reality of a character into the space between those contradictions, I think you get some pretty interesting stuff. Like James, you were just saying, like, oh, this guy's an administrator who he wants to see the job done, but he doesn't want to do it himself.
Yeah. Or even just the interpretation. I've had jobs where the job, if you have to go do the job, you have to go do the job. But people are interpreting things as like, we don't have to do that now. We don't have to do it yet. We don't have to do it under these circumstances. And I'm like, you're just making excuses to stay sitting there and not doing anything. And I mean, you're accurate. You're by the book, but you're opting to sit there and not go do the thing, which is how you're interpreting everything. That's just, yeah. I'm instantly seeing it. But it's a great, I think it's a great tool for creating a character, is to give them, like you said, a paradoxical makeup, and then try to make it work. Try to find the true line, because people are complicated. People are walking hypocrisies all the time.
Yes,
you know what I mean.
Yes,
I think that's a big thing about if you're trying to make a real character, is to make them, say one thing and do another, or to have one view or have one belief about themselves, but have them go a different direction with what they do in life.
And it kind of also sets them up with an automatic inner tension as well, like an inner turmoil that can drive the story. They feel this, but they do this. They think this, but they feel this. Which both feels real, and there's a motive.
And that tension makes for like exciting reading as well, because it makes them unpredictable. You don't know which way they're gonna lean.
I just like, this is actually, I don't think I've ever felt this frustrated during a conversation before, because normally like we think about these things and I feel like I'm able to get a pretty good idea of like, yeah, this is what I need. Like, this is how I would look at, like, this is what I would look for in these scenarios. And I kind of get vague guidelines that I can kind of rely on inside of me. But when it comes to characters, the more I think about it, it's just like, it really is just experimentation. And like, maybe you write the same chapter 3 times before you get the chapter with the actual character in it, because you just need to actually like spend time with these people, and they become people the more you spend time with them.
Yeah.
And then I was kind of thinking from there, and there really are no wrong answers. Like, you could just end up with a really interesting, like, you could recreate a character that already exists, or you could create someone entirely new. Like, there's no whatever. And then one thing, like some random, I guess, tools, just more tools I was thinking, is just like different frames of how you could think about it. And one is, in a story, you have your main plot, your main narrative, and it's almost like that is everyone's job, is the narrative. They're going to get through this job and stuff. And so that would be a one-dimensional character, because it's like they only exist as the plot and they're part in that plot. That'd be a very one-dimensional person.
They're a function of the plot, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then it's like, all right, so then you have your plot, put characters on it, and then just give every single character a hobby. Even if they don't do it on the page, just give them a hobby. And that just like, just puts a little drop in the petri dish to see what happens. And it just starts adding little bits of depth. So just as an exercise, it's like, oh, that's a fun way to think about it.
It was something that I was really reminded me when you were making the points of like the character traits on the page. It's like you can plan a character, but you can't plan realisticness or verisimilitude with a character. It's like that has to come with the writing.
Fully.
Like you can give the character a quirky hobby, but it's only through writing the character and then have the character like interpret situations via their hobby that makes the character you know what I mean? If you have a character who loves flying kites, and now you have him, his job is, I don't know, he's a cop, but he loves flying kites on the weekend or whatever. And now you have him interpret situations based on wind speed, or get the colors that go together.
Or you can get into what it is he loves about flying kites. Like, this sort of thing, I think, also helps inform backstory and where characters come from. So I don't think you have to know exactly why a character's doing what they're doing from like their personal chronology, but like, let's say the cop that likes flying kites, like, why does he love flying kites? What happened? What are the events in his life that led to that? Like, what was the seed of that? I think that can help you as an author backfill all of these little details that help make someone real. Like, well, why do they like flying kites? Why do they have like a strong prejudice against like a certain religion? Why do they? It's all backfill, I think, right? These details force us to think like, okay, well, obviously there's a reason why he's like this. And
Phoenix, I believe you have a reading. That's me leading.
I do have a reading. it's actually it's the best example I could find of characterization in a small 500-word chunk. But it's a first draft. I haven't really drafted this much, so grain of salt for this one. Another caveat, I am using little bits of a language that I really don't understand at all. It's the Ojibwe language, so my pronunciation is going to be completely crap, and might be completely wrong. I might be using these words incorrectly, but just stay with me. And this is what will probably be a short story. And it's called Asabi Keshin at the moment. For a moment, it was dark. I knew I was in his room, but I couldn't yet see the walls. I could only hear him breathing. I hadn't yet spoken. Once I did, I knew things would change. The quiet world would begin to stir into action. Things would move. To speak in a sleeping room is to speak motion, to animate. The lights were off. He was only breathing, not aware of how steady and calm his own breath was. I decided to let him enjoy a few more breaths and looked out the window to watch the fog. It hung on the windless air, waiting for the sun. Goshkazi, Mingun, Goshkazi. He moved under his sheets. The silence that held the room so softly until now swirled and mixed. Jonathan, wake up. What time is it? 3:40. We have a call. I thought you might come with me this time. Really? I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel it in his voice, an excitement weighed down by gravity. You're old enough, I said. He sat up. Get your things and meet me in the kitchen in 10 minutes. I looked at him through the darkness. For a moment, then ran my fingers through his hair. It was soft and his head was still warm from sleep. Mino gigizeb. Good morning, he said back. The kitchen held the same quiet that I found resting in Jonathan's room, though this one had a bubbling that was animating the air over in the corner on the counter. I had set the coffee to brew, and now its smell peppered the air, the rising steam silently warming the chill that took residence while we slept. The morning is potential, my father used to say. What is the first word you will say today? Your day will form around it. I said good morning to my son. The bubbling became more excited now. I knew the silence would soon be completely banished by the shrill beep of a ready pot of coffee. Veep, veep! The chirp I hear well before the birds most mornings. I started feeling through the shadow-filled cabinet for my favorite mug. I could recognize it by feel quite easily, mostly because I refused to turn on lights if I was up before the sun. It made it nearly impossible to see, and even once my eyes adjusted, I still needed to feel around for the known walls and corners of the house. However, the electric flood of light early in the morning was too invasive. My hand finally landed on the smooth clay with the lines I knew. My thumb found the chip along the rim. Got you. The steamy black waterfall streams to fill my Winnie the Pooh mug as the soft squeak of rubber shuffling on wood enters behind me. Ready? I call over my shoulder. N. Yes. That's the end. Or I'll stop.
Beautiful. The little details. Yeah. The little details you put in actually do make the character, like, there's very little dialogue, but I feel like I know this guy more so.
Yeah.
The fact that he doesn't want to, like, intrude on the darkness with electric light. He has a Winnie the Pooh mug and a favorite mug, the running the hair through the hand through the son's hair and, like, feeling the warmth. Yeah, really, really good. Really, really nice stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I really like this one. But yeah, it's one of the characters that's why I read it. It's like there was a lot of characterization in that moment. Yeah.
I felt that for sure.
It makes me think as well, we didn't touch on this, so I don't want to, like, reopen the whole worm can. I'm trying to close this out. But things like the texture, like the tactile sense of, like, the warmth of his son's hair. And I wonder to what extent those kind of, like, adding in those intimate sensory details, even without knowing much about a character, help us feel like a character's more real, because we can't help but inhabit them when we're given those sensory cues. When we're brought into the story, we imagine characters more real because we feel like the story is more real.
I think those like grounding details ground you in a story
Details.
much better. And I think that does help for like realism in a character. I remember one of the best lines I think I ever read, and I think Stephen King, in my opinion, does very real characters, because he seems to like really put like a person on a page in a very good way. In his book, I forget the name, 1165 something or other. It's one where the character travels back in time to stop the John F. Kennedy assassination. The character has gone back in time to like the 1950s, and it's very, wow, now you're back in time to the 1950s, and it's a little bit bombastic. And he walks into a bar and he orders a beer. And when the bartender turns around to like make the beer, it's a single line. I think it's like a one-word sentence, probably takes up 3 lines of the page. And it is so grounding. It just puts you right there in the scene. And it's literally the hand motions of the bartender pouring the pint and then scooping the foam off the top and handing the beer across to your man. And it was so grounding after all of the, like, it's almost like the character can't get his bearings, and you were kind of like, well, this is very fantastic what's happening. But the character can't get his bearings because he's just come back in time, sits in, orders a beer, and then that single motion of there's your beer. Incredible, really, really grounding, really, really immersive. I think it's probably one of the best lines in any Stephen King work that I've read, because it was so immersive, and it accomplished the job of putting you like in the scene so well.
Nice.
It made everything feel real, and I guess it gives you that feeling of looking at the situation through the character's perspective.
And taking it on as your own perspective.
And Paddy, I believe you have a quote.
Oh, I do, James.
I also heard tell that you had a quote.
Why, as a matter of fact, I do. This is a quote by author Kirsten Lamb. Great fiction is fueled by bad decisions and human weakness. Kirsten Lamb. Short but sweet. I think it's kind of true.
And what did she write, Kirsten Lamb?
She is a fantasy author, and you can see her back catalogue at author Kirsten Lamb. KristenLamb.com. Kristen, I'm so sorry for butchering your name, but we've given you a quote, so now you're immortalized in Precipice fiction.
Awesome. All right, and that has been
The podcast.
That's it. It's over.
Yeah,
This is done.
Hope you enjoyed. We certainly did. This is Paddy, Phoenix, and James signing off.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.